Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our Chartered Insurance Institute webinar with Flaxman Partners. I'm Catherine Kennett, Policy and Public Affairs Manager at the Chartered Insurance Institute, and I would like to welcome you all to our session on the complaints procedure, marking your own homework. It was once accepted wisdom that the British were too polite to complain when things went wrong. In some ways, this is still true, but not when it comes to financial services. The current regime had its beginnings in 1981 when the insurance fraternity was the first industry to introduce its own ombudsman scheme. An arrangement that started out as a facility for policymakers to use rarely when common sense failed has now become commonplace. Flaxmans believe the time has come for a fresh review of the complaints procedure. As an introduction to this theme, join Roger Flaxman and Michael Wilson on the first of a brand new series of webinars delivered exclusively for CII members. They will explain the complaints procedure, highlight the problems that arise, and gently suggest where there might be for improvement. So we have with us today Roger Flaxman, Chairman and Principal Consultant, and Michael Wilson, Director at Flaxman's Partners, who I'm sure a lot of you attending this webinar today will already have seen before. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to use the question box that you can see on your screen, and we will work through these once the webinar is complete. Over to you.
Good morning and welcome to the first of our 2024 webinar series. I'm Roger Flaxman, and with me, as always, is Michael Wilson. Now, complaints about insurance have increased some tenfold over the last 25 years, and there's no sign that they're going to reduce soon. Inevitably, some of those complaints are proven to be unjustified, but by no means all of them. Our day-to-day business concerns insurance claims that have gone awry and often become the subject of a complaint. Very often we find that the complaint is not really dealt with at all satisfactorily, and that's when we are asked to get involved. So we have plenty of first-hand experience of what is good and what is not so good about the claims processes and service. The CII continues to promote professionalism in our day-to-day practice, both for underwriters and brokers. And as you will know, there can be a considerable satisfaction in getting a good and fair outcome for your client, knowing that you have exercised your professional knowledge and skill to the best of your ability. A lot of us just want that to be part of our daily life. That's what we're here for. A fair outcome for our customers is surely the holy grail of what we want to give them. But a fair outcome is also at the epicenter of the purpose of the Financial Ombudsman Service. A fair outcome is best achieved, in our opinion, by applying what we all know as experienced insurance practitioners. It's knowing the right thing to do at the right time when things go off the rails, and sometimes they do. Now, the right thing or right thing to do is very often instinctive to us because we're in the industry and we know how it works. And it doesn't need to be overcomplicated, and it certainly very often doesn't need to be sent to lawyers for a legal opinion. I'll say this, and I'll probably say it more than once. In the insurance industry, we know a lot more about insurance than lawyers do. And I know that because I work with them every day of the week. They know the law, but they've not practiced as you have. And keep that in mind, because a lot of insurance people are in awe of the law, and you shouldn't be, because it's a blunt instrument. So as insurance practitioners, we instinctively know what bargain we've struck with our valued customers. In other words, the underwriter says, I know what I want to give you for cover, and here it is, and I'll do it. And that's part of the, if you like, the good faith contract between the parties. we can adapt our reasoning and our intentions to match what we think, what we wanted to do, when it's gone awry. But the law can't do that. It can only interpret the insurance as observers, without the benefit of knowing how or why the bargain was struck in the first place, and without knowing the commercial sensitivities that are present in so much insurance business. Now, the reason the courts ask for expert evidence to be given is that the judge wants to know what is considered good practice across the market. Good practice in underwriting practice, administrative practice, broking practice, good practice. How it works in practice day to day. That's what the judge wants to know. Because the judge recognises that the law can sometimes be a blunt instrument, and themselves not having any practical experience in day-to-day insurance, they want to hear from us as to what is ordinary good practice, which by definition is the basis of a fair outcome. So, the FCA litigation on BI COVID claims, most of us will have read some part of it, and we've read an awful lot of it. And I think that it's proven conclusively that the law is a blunt instrument, because in many respects, in our opinion, the decisions arrived at in the various policies are not particularly fair. And the fundamental point is, if you get a whole raft of policy wordings which we as in practitioners all thought, well, I said more or less the same thing but different words, to find that actually they mean something completely and utterly different is a shock. And that's a problem. We believe it will help every one of us if we better understand how well-managed complaints and the fair treatment of our customers can make such a difference to the public's trust in us all. So with that opening remark, I'll hand over to Mike, who will take us through the learning objectives and into the meat of this webinar. Mike.
Thank you, Roger. Pardon me. Just to go through the learning objectives then, is to review the history of the insurer's complaints procedures, to understand the regulatory basis of complaints, to be able to recognise what is, and more particularly what isn't, a complaint, to understand the life of a complaint from its cause to its resolution, to discuss the independence of the complaints process, and then to review the qualifying rules and the limits of the Financial Ombudsman Service. So I'm going to start off just a very quick review of the history of the complaints process. Now, a lot of this is focused on the Ombudsman's role, and of course not all complaints end up with an Ombudsman, but it's quite important just to have a general understanding of the history of the Ombudsman. And it was in 1981 that the Insurance Ombudsman Bureau came into being. Before that, there was no independent complaints process at all. Now, the chief principle of any ombudsman scheme is that it presents a forum for a dispute to be aired in a way that presents the consumer or the business with an opportunity for a grievance to be assessed independently. Whether a complaint is against government or big business, an ombudsman scheme acts to equalise the strength of the parties. And that's something that never existed before the ombudsman scheme came into being. So another thing just to flag up is that when the ombudsman scheme was first introduced, it only applied to consumers, that is, private individuals. There was no cover at all for business complaints, and that's something that came in much later on. So I think most of us are grateful for the fact that the Ombudsman scheme exists. If you're an insurer, there may be times when you take the view that the Ombudsman doesn't back you often enough. But when it comes to issues of public trust in insurance, we're very much in support of the Ombudsman scheme. We think it's a good thing. Yes, sometimes there are delays and sometimes we don't like their decisions, but we're very much in favour of it being there. And we'll be talking a little bit more about the Ombudsman a little bit later on. But talking of complaints generally, Roger, I'm just wondering if you could give us a quick rundown on the regulatory basis of complaints, because it's not just a matter of dealing with complaints in any way that you feel like it. It's all regulated, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Well, it's quite simple, really, and it's on the slide in front of you now. The most important thing about a complaint, bar nothing, is for it to be specific. If a complaint you're making to anybody isn't specific, if it's a sort of a ramble of dissatisfaction, it won't go anywhere because there's nothing for anybody to get a handle on. So what the principle here is to say, I'm not going to read all this out, but to send a prompt written acknowledgement is just polite, really, isn't it? It's just the right thing to do. It's got to issue a response within a certain period of time because that is fair and reasonable. And the process that has been in place for the last, 25 years, 30 years now, basically says, well, if you don't like the answer, you can go to the FOS. Now, all of that is absolutely fine, provided that that is the process that is adhered to with the spirit or in the spirit of trying to resolve it. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's, oh, we'll look at this complaint a couple of days before 8 weeks is up, and we'll tell you nothing you've said to us changes our opinion. Please go to, you can go to the FOS if you like. And that's really not within the spirit of the complaints process. But the regulatory basis, in our opinion, is still fit for purpose and works.
Roger, I'd like to have a conversation with you about what is and what isn't a complaint.
Yeah.
But before we do that, could you just run through this slide? Because
yes,
the DISP rules are perhaps a little bit more detailed than most people realise.
Very often somebody starts when we have a conversation about a complaint, they start and say, well, it's an expression of dissatisfaction. Yes, it is. But you've got to read the rest of it because this definition is quite specific. And actually, I think it's comprehensively correct. It's an expression of dissatisfaction, whether justified or not. Some expressions of dissatisfaction are not justified, and that makes it much harder for the recipient of the complaint to know what to do. Sometimes they do nothing, and that's not good. It can be from or on behalf of a person. It doesn't have to be from the person themselves. And it's got to be connected with a financial service. Now, it must, however, allege that the complainant has suffered financial loss, material distress, or material inconvenience. And what I said a few moments ago is it is having to be specific. That's where the specificity comes in. It's got to be about something that you can hang your hat on one of those tabs. And it's also got to relate to an activity of that respondent, of the person you're complaining to. So it's no point in complaining to somebody about somebody else's errors. You've got to complain to the right person about what they've done. And it's got to come under the jurisdiction of the FOS, which I think in most cases we see they do.
Now, Roger, we see a lot of complaints,
We do.
although usually when we identify that there's uh, a difficulty between the policyholder and the insurer,
Yeah.
or indeed sometimes against a broker, um, we generally uh, try to close the gap and avoid it becoming a complaint. And one problem that I think both you and I have sometimes is that we want an opportunity to discuss the matter with an insurer without it automatically becoming a complaint. And I think this is
Yes.
part of the problem that um, sometimes an automatic assumption that any expression of dissatisfaction is automatically something to be treated as a formal complaint can sometimes get in the way of a sensible conversation.
Yes, it can. I think one of the problems is, let's speak about the complaints procedure first. If something has been made as a complaint, the natural human reaction is to say, well, I'm going to protect my back. I'm going to protect my position. I'm not changing my mind. I'm right. So if somebody complains, you say, well, sorry, but I don't agree with you and I'm not going to change my mind. That is a natural reaction in complaints generally. If, on the other hand, somebody says, I'm making this complaint, and the other person takes the view that sometimes you've heard, or certainly in our lifetime, Mike, I'm not sure if younger people have, but the customer is always right. That used to be said quite a lot. I don't know if it is now, because the customer isn't always right. But actually, if you start with saying, well, actually, maybe the customer's got a point, let's look at this again, then that overcomes the first barrier to a complaint, which is it shouldn't be hostile and it shouldn't be, what's the word, aggressive, what's the word I'm looking for, adversarial.
Confrontational.
Confrontational, yeah. Now, going back to your point, when we see complaints, we normally see them after the complaint has been made. But actually, as you say, what we try to do is to take the heat out of the complaint and look at it and say, well, actually, what is the issue here that's complained about? And sometimes these complaints are very substantial. One of the complaints we get, I think, more and more, Mike, is the time it takes insurers to make a decision about policy coverage. And, some of them
Yes.
are weeks, months. We've had some for years. And you can't, under any circumstances, justify that unless there is some very substantial thing wrong with the insured, possibly potential of fraud or something like that. But normally, people are waiting. They're literally hanging on the minutes of when an insurer says, yeah, okay, we're going to pay you, because it's their livelihood. So when you get things like that, part of the process we try to engender is that we'll go and talk to the insurer. And quite a lot of insurers are very happy to do it. And say, oh, actually, nice to talk to you. Let's have a chat about this. Some won't. Some will say, no, we're not discussing it. We don't have to under the rules. We can just send you off to the FOS. I don't think that's terribly good.
Thank you, Roger. I just want to move on to just look at the life of a complaint, because it picks up on what you were saying before about the complaint needing to be specific. We do often find that where a complaint has not really achieved what anybody hoped for is where the original complaint hasn't been framed properly. I was looking at a case just recently where indeed the main gripe of the policyholder was to do with the length of time that things were taking to be resolved. And the claim had started in January last year, and they were complaining about the delay in January this year.
Yes.
But the way the complaint was framed, it only complained about the activity that had happened since last November.
Yeah.
So that was the complaint that was put in. And so the insurer only responded quite correctly
to the complaint that's
on
been
the
made.
specifics of the complaint. And actually the frustrations that the policyholder had experienced earlier in the previous year were totally ignored. And that could easily have been done if the complaint had been properly framed in the first place. And quite a lot of complaints are about delay, whereas they'd be better off saying, well, yes, I am dissatisfied about the time this has taken, but I'm also dissatisfied that, for instance, the insurance company thinks I'm underinsured. And if you put that
Yes.
in the complaint, then it can be properly
Yes, I think
investigated.
this is my one of the points that we discuss between ourselves quite often, don't we? Is that you could think that if the spirit of the complaints process has any merit, then the recipient of the complaint will say they're complaining about the last 6 months, but actually, when we look at this goes back for nearly 2 years. We ought to address that, and the fact that they don't, I think, is poor. And the fact that, taking the other point you just made, that if, for example, they were saying, and also we think you're underinsured, but not saying why, the spirit of a complaint process, the whole point of the complaint process is to avoid litigation, to try to get the right customer outcome. And sometimes it would behove the recipient of the complaint to take it a step further and say, well, actually, let's see if we can engage rather than just bat it back. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, that's what we would like to see. I'm not going to go through this slide, but you will have access to our fact sheet at the end of this webinar. So some of these things you can have a look at your leisure. But Roger, I think this is an important issue of impartiality. I wonder if you could introduce us to this aspect.
Yes. Impartiality. Well, the problem, again, and I think we've already alluded to this, is that when you're making a complaint, the recipient of the complaint is starting from the position is, well, we get, we know what we're doing, we've got it right. And I think it's fair to say that every one of us, everybody listening to this webinar would say that if you make a complaint to somebody and you say, I'm going to go to the top, I'm going to go above your head because I want a second opinion, to find that you go above the head and then it's passed back to the person that you're complaining about, you could regard that as disappointing. But it happens too often. And it happens very often because in some places, in our experience, the complaints process isn't taken seriously at all. It is just a process to get it off the desk and get it into the ombudsman or get it into lawyers. And that is disappointing. But the point about impartiality is that to be impartial, if you were to take this as a test to anybody outside the industry, i.e. into the legal profession, which is the next most likely place you'll go if you don't get satisfaction, impartiality means starting with a fresh mind and actually sometimes looking at it with the view that I may have to come to a conclusion that isn't in my interest. In other words, I didn't really want to have to go there, but actually I think if I'm impartial, that's the conclusion I would come to. That's what impartiality is. So this rule saying investigate the complaint competently, diligently, and impartially, you couldn't put that better, could you? Competence, let's say we're all competent. Diligent, we're doing it because we think we need to, not because we have to. Impartially, don't give it back to the same person that's being complained about because they can't be impartial. And then the last bit, obtaining additional information as necessary. Very often, and Mike, I can't remember the last time this happens, you might, I don't remember in a complaint that we've had to handle ever being asked a question which would help them to inform, better inform what the facts might be behind the situation. We have to make the running. We're very rarely does the
I've never known.
recipient.
I mean, we can only report on the cases we see. So
Yeah, quite.
it might
Yeah,
not be entirely representative.
No, absolutely
but
not.
I have never handled a complaint or submitted a complaint to an insurer where they would write back and confirm the basis of the complaint, and they would investigate it. I've never known an insurer to come back to me and ask for additional information or
No,
for clarity. It
no.
sometimes gives the impression of quite an automated process.
Mm.
Now, I must also say that we come across some excellent complaints departments and excellent service at the
Yeah,
complaint stage. We're not
yeah, we do.
we're
Mm.
not we're not
This is
here
not
to
everybody by any means.
castigate
No.
the but what we are doing is we're highlighting those cases where the practice could be better. And uh, there's one trend that bothers me, and that is that there are some insurers who are so quick to deal with a complaint that you could put in the complaint on the Monday and you can have the final decision on the
Yeah,
Wednesday. Now you
yeah.
might say, well, that's superb service, but is that really fully demonstrating the impartiality that we're looking for, or the
Well,
diligence, or the sense of
or the
inquiry?
diligently, because you can't very often. And most of the complaints we see have got some degree of complexity in them, or something where we know from our own job the time it takes to read into a case. It can be hours, can't it? Sometimes days.
Yeah,
You can't do these things on. So if somebody's doing it on the last letter of the file, as they say, oh well, we told them that last time. Just tell them that again. The expression that often comes out, you haven't said anything that's going to change our mind. I think that's just rude.
yeah.
Bluntly.
So
Yeah.
moving on then, just a very quick rundown on the Financial Ombudsman Service. We've covered this in previous webinars, and again, this information will be in the fact sheet. But just to highlight the qualifying rules, I mentioned before that originally the Ombudsman scheme didn't apply to businesses at all, and that's been extended significantly in recent years to the extent that it's only businesses that have a turnover in excess of 6.5 million that don't qualify. And actually this was increased, I think, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And actually, there are still some in the insurance industry that have slightly lost sight of that. So it's not just small business. If your business is turning over almost 6.5 million a year, it's not really a small business. So that has changed quite a lot. Just a word about the time limits. We don't often come across time limits being an issue on general insurance, but it can be. So if you're in receipt of a complaint and you think that the aspect that's being complained about was more than 6 years ago, it might be that it's too late for that complaint to be investigated. Now that's unusual with a general insurance policy, but there might be some delegates here who are on the life and pension side of the business, and certainly with long-term insurances, including life and pensions. I've guided independent financial advisors on dealing with complaints that have been made against them. But on examination, it's turned out that the policy or the investment had been sold to the client more than 6 years ago. And furthermore, it could be shown that more than 3 years ago, the client had reason to believe that he might have cause for complaint. He's just late submitting it. And when that happens, the broker or the IFA doesn't even have to investigate the facts of the case. All they have to do is to respond by saying, sorry, in our opinion, you're out of time. So it's just something to be aware of. Similarly, the award limits have escalated quite quickly in recent years, and the current award limit from the FOS is 415,000, which is a fair sum of money. So it's good just to be aware of those limits. Now, I'd like to have a talk about this, Roger, the fair and reasonable remit. We've been going into the history and the beginnings of the Ombudsman, and the original mission statement, which I don't believe is much different today, is to resolve disputes in an independent, impartial, cost-effective, efficient, and an informal way. And one of the original ombudsmen spelt this out. And it's not something that you would come across very often. So it's good to just remind ourselves of the beginnings. Because the section in italics is a direct quote from one of the early ombudsmen. And he said, where the legal arguments favour the policyholder, they are entitled to the benefit of the law. Well, that's not controversial. When the law is not in their favour, I have to see whether conventional good practice nevertheless swings the balance in their favour. And that's crucial to grab hold of that, because that is an option that the Ombudsman still retains, even though these words were written many years ago. And in fact, he goes even further. He says, where it does not, i.e. good practice fails to swing the balance in the policyholder's favour, I can still exercise my discretionary power to go beyond the law and conventional good practice if I consider that is necessary to provide a fair and reasonable solution. Now, Roger, we both look at ombudsman decisions. We both deal with these things.
Yeah.
Roger, what would your comment be as to the extent to which this fair and reasonable discretion is actually operated these days?
I'm afraid I think it's a lot less than it used to be. You know, we've both been doing this a long time. I've been doing it 25 years. And I'm afraid that the tendency nowadays is for the legal opinion to carry the weight. And where the legal opinion isn't fair, the Ombudsman will say, well, you know, that's our decision. It's sad because it doesn't really go to the whole purpose of the Ombudsman, which is to avoid litigation, to create better outcomes for the customer, for the policyholder. And if we had time, we could give hundreds of examples of where the law and insurance are very incompatible bedfellows, because a legal interpretation of something in an insurance policy often, really, we've all been there. You look at it and say, nah, can't mean that. But if that's the interpretation that's put on it, and the FCA decisions, some of them have gone exactly that way, and we see lots of others, then the sentiments expressed by this Ombudsman are just out of the window. And I think they need to be brought back. Because as we've said many times before, if a contract of insurance isn't based upon the principles of good faith, i.e. the intention of the contract, then it fails at the first hurdle. Because contracts of insurance are too complicated for the public to be able to discern what the legal nuances might be. It just doesn't work. And I'm probably one of the few people that you'll hear say that, because I think the modern view is, well, if the contract says that and the lawyers say that, it must be right. We don't agree. I think very often the sentiment expressed here ought to be the bedrock of the way that we look at fair outcomes and how we aim to resolve complaints. And we should encourage the Ombudsman to reconsider this as their matrix and their mantra. But
well, Roger, if we feel that the FOS possibly doesn't use this discretion to the full these days,
yeah,
and I think we're coming to that conclusion.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering what is it that's led to that? Because you have commented before that inside some insurers, when a difficult decision has got to be reached on policy coverage, quite often that decision isn't taken by an insurance professional at all, but maybe rather too easily, the issues put out to their lawyers to decide on policy coverage, rather than the insurer making an in-house decision. And I know that's what you feel because you said that before, but
Well, I
do
mean,
you
I'm not
think
just
that
feel,
this has
I've
got a carryover?
actually see it happen. But I think one of the problems is that a long time ago, I mean, when we started in insurance, lawyers didn't get involved in claims. It's a comparatively recent phenomenon. I mean, certainly it was the 80s when it really sort of took off. And one of the reasons for that was it wasn't until the mid-80s that legal liability became such a huge, huge problem. It was a big, it's escalated. People say that it crossed the pond from the Atlantic, the compensation culture. Whether you accept that or not, the fact is it has changed enormously. And once lawyers said, well, actually, we're very happy to take on this work and we'll help you make the right decisions. The point is, what is making the right decision? And my view is that and this is something I learned by being in the specialist in D&O insurance and banks and PI and things like that for quite a long time, is that there was very much the culture of businesses generally saying, and insurance companies was, we can't afford to make a decision because it might upset the shareholders. Our shareholders would expect us to get a legal opinion. Now, if you turn that into the professional way of life, if a solicitor says, I don't want to make a decision on behalf of my practice because my practice is now a company or an LLP and I don't want to upset anybody else, I'll go and get another legal opinion, or my legal opinion, becomes absurd. Similarly with accountants and surveyors and engineers, if every time they get a difficult decision to make, they go, well, let's go and ask a lawyer. But we do in the insurance industry. Now, there's a lot of insurers, and let's be fair about this, a lot of insurers do make these decisions in-house. I'm not suggesting it doesn't happen, but the question is, why doesn't it happen all the time? And actually, I think a lot of the industry has lost the confidence in its own professionalism. Well, we're not clever enough, we're not good enough to make a decision. But you know, when I go into court and cross-examined on things that are ordinary aspects of insurance, quite often the court is quite surprised at how well balanced and sensible the legal practice, insurance practice is in practice. When you set it out and say, well, this is what the ordinary expectation was, well, that makes sense. But it's not what it says in the policy, because the policies they're too imprecise to be able to capture the essence of good insurance practice. So I think...
Thank you, Roger. Sorry,
that's all. I could go on for hours about it, but that's the essence of it.
I want to give us an example which we've actually used before.
Yes.
Some of you will be familiar with it, but it just illustrates where the legal application can mislead.
Can confound something.
Our example here is of a household policy where the insurer wants all of its policyholders to have 5-lever mortise deadlocks on all exterior doors. So an insurer who wants to do that can do it in one of two ways. They can either include the subject on the statement of fact, so that in effect the client confirms at the outset of the contract that all their doors have got the required locks. Or alternatively, instead of doing that, the insurer can put a condition or a warranty on the policy that says that all doors must have the required locks. So the insured suffers a burglary, but the point of entry and exit is a broken window. So, but it also turns out that the door's locks are not up to scratch. So the insured hasn't complied, but the break-in has occurred a different way. The locks on the doors were not material because they came in through a window. So this is the problem, that if the insurer has chosen option A and included the issue on the statement of fact, the policy may be avoided. But if the insurer had gone the other option and cater for the issue by putting a condition or a warranty on the policy, because that breach of warranty would not have been causative of the claim, then the claim could not be rejected. So you have similar circumstances. The problem has been dealt with differently by two different insurers and two different outcomes in the same set of circumstances. Now, if you took that argument to a lawyer and the insurer had used option A and had incorporated the problem in the statement of fact, the lawyer would always say to the insurer, yes, you're perfectly entitled to void the policy and you need not pay the claim, because it's not the lawyer's position to exercise discretion. The lawyer is an expert in the law. He's not an expert in insurance. And that's why we quote this example. And of course, we've seen it in other examples, such as our famous House on the Hill case, where the client hadn't declared the proximity of a river, and then there was a flood. But in the end, the flood was shown to have been totally irrelevant to the nearby river. And that case was handled through lawyers, and the claim was never paid. So the reason we're highlighting this here is that when looking at the fair and reasonable remit of the Ombudsman, to be honest with you, although we're very, very supportive of the Ombudsman Service, we're disappointed that this sort of problem is quite rarely dealt with under the fair and reasonable principle.
And I think, Mike, just to go back,
often sorry, go on.
Well, just the point you made about the House on the Hill, the Ombudsman had that referred to them and they followed the legal opinion, didn't they?
They did, yes.
Which was
and we
disappointing.
were disappointed with that because we felt that there was a golden opportunity for the Ombudsman to exercise the discretion that he has in law.
Yeah. I mean, the point is that in this particular case, there was no prospect at all of that house being flooded from any natural watercourse or canal or anything. The only reason it happened was because a local authority drain backed up the hill and caused all the water to flow down the hill into the houses. And it was the only house in the road where the insurers didn't pay up. And, you know, and the Ombudsman... Can I also say that the Ombudsman backed the law rather than common sense.
But we know of insurers who would in-house deal with it on a fair and reasonable
absolutely we do. So
we're not saying that all insurers take legalistic decisions. They don't.
No.
But it's disappointing when you come across it. And we would like to encourage the FOS to maybe rediscover this principle. And I'm sure we'll be having an opportunity to discuss that with them. I'm conscious, Roger, we haven't got much time and we want to allow some time for questions.
Yes.
We've jotted down before that just one or two thoughts from us for improvement. And I don't really think we have the time to discuss this a lot. But again, it's in our fact sheet. Do have a look at it and let us know if you have any views of your own. And I think the only thing I would stress at this point is the last one, because it's exciting to see the way that AI is going to apparently improve the claims process. But we've got to retain the human element, because quite often when we hear people who are very disappointed about their claims experience with their insurer, they often say, but there was nobody I could talk to about it. And you're the first people that would listen to me. So we do need to make sure that we retain the human element, especially when things go wrong.
And I think just to add to that, the fact, what we do with these complaints, the success that we have in resolving them is all about dialogue. It's not about systems, procedures, or even rules. It's all about actually talking it through, having a discussion with the other party, open discussion with the insurer. There's always two sides to a story, and sometimes there's three. And when people listen, become awake to it and say, actually, I see the point, then 9.5 times out of 10, they say, okay, well, look, how about doing this? And then you suddenly get a happy customer. And it's not difficult. And it doesn't require the law. It just requires the human element. And that is what rekindles the trust of the public in our business.
Thank you. Well, back to you, Catherine. I think you've been keeping an eye on some of the questions that have been coming in.
Thank you very much. Very informative, as always. We have lots of questions, as to be expected, so I'll crack on with a few now. Going back to the beginning, where we talked about complaints, we've got a question asking, what is the position when a complaint is acknowledged with in a timely manner? And this chap has said, we have a complaint against a well-known premium finance provider that they haven't acknowledged some 3 weeks later. The issues go back to 2023, which they have failed to fix.
What's the question?
Well, if I can answer that, I believe the DISP rules show that they should acknowledge promptly. I'm not too sure that it's within a particular time. But of course, the business does have the statutory 8 weeks to respond. And it looks to me, in a case like that, that the complainant can have no confidence that the business is going to respond within the 8 weeks. But remember that once the 8 weeks has passed, even if they've had no response and no decision, at that point, they can take it to the Financial Ombudsman.
Thank you very much. We've also been asked, how do you correctly assess what is material in terms of inconvenience?
The consequences
It's
of
very
not
much,
getting a response. Inconvenience is fundamentally, I'm just thinking how to answer this quickly, but inconvenience is annoying, but if the inconvenience causes you a financial loss or some other tangible, measurable loss or damage, that's how you measure it.
Excellent. So we've got a question from Stephen Challoner. You keep talking about the spirit of the complaint, but this has to go both ways. Too many customers head straight into a complaints process without giving the firm a chance to resolve the matter informally. They force an adversarial approach by making threats of legal action or an approach to the media. The likes of Martin Lewis has to shoulder a lot of the blame for this. Do you agree?
Yes.
Well, can I respond?
I think that's a good point. Go on, Mike. I agree. I agree with that.
Stephen, yes, I agree with you entirely. I was looking at a case recently where a client had come to us and they had already submitted 4 separate complaints on the one claim. Now, of course, that does nothing to encourage us to step in and help, because we think, well, this is probably somebody that's beyond help. So not all policyholders are reasonable. Yes, they're adversarial right from the outset sometimes, and that's what makes the complaint handling particularly difficult. And if it's any consolation, when policyholders come to us in the earlier stages and they say, should we put in a complaint? 9 times out of 10, we say, no, don't put in a complaint. Let's have a sensible conversation.
The other thing I would say in answer to that question is that when it does happen, it would be really good to see a letter go back to that person saying, we acknowledge that you've made 4 complaints and you're threatening legal action. Can we just say that we've got this to consider, we are taking it seriously, and it will benefit you considerably if you give us reasonable time to engage. Something of that type. Just slam it back to them and say, get off our back, because that would go down very well if it went to court later to show that you had responded positively, firmly, but proportionately, in saying to them, you're not going to get anywhere with this, mate. Give us some time to do it. But I agree with the sentiments that were expressed. It does go both ways, absolutely. Yeah.
And following on from that, Philip Johnson has said, regarding people unhappy about premiums going up, a recent interaction with the compliance consultant suggested that these should be treated as a complaint, i.e. as a broker, treat as third-party complaint and escalate to the insurer to send a final response. Is this approach realistic?
No. Mike?
No, I don't think it is. It's generally accepted that an insurer has got the freedom to price its products
Yeah.
in whatever way it thinks appropriate.
Yeah.
And a complaint along those lines wouldn't get very far.
It hasn't got any prospects of success, no. I think what I would say, in fact, we've got a case at the moment, I think, that somebody had a claim which was paid, and the premium went up 5 times afterwards, and they've made a complaint, and they've come to us for advice. Well, even that, I think, it's not terribly helpful that the insurer pays a claim and then just nonchalantly increases the premium by 5 times. It's a kind of indication they don't want the business. But if that's the case, why don't they say so? And, and the broker can help sort something out. But I still don't think that makes it a complaint under the context of, complaints for the FOS. It's a commercial deal. You either accept it or you don't. Go elsewhere.
Thank you very much. We've got 2 questions from Abra Henry. Apologies if I've mispronounced your name, but the first one is, what recourse is available for firms who do not qualify for the Financial Ombudsman? The second question is, while the Ombudsman is set as a mediator of complaints between the individual and the firm, is there recourse if the individual disagrees with the findings of the Ombudsman?
Mike, why don't you take the second one first? I'll take the second one first. That don't forget that when you get an initial decision, or maybe correctly phrased, an opinion from the Ombudsman, if one side or the other does not accept that, then of course you have the right of referral for a formal Ombudsman's determination. So colloquially, you might call that an initial appeals process. But once an Ombudsman has issued a determination, and if the insurer, let's say, accept it, but the policyholder does not, and he feels that the decision taken by the Ombudsman is not fair or is not thorough enough, well, on the face of it, there's no automatic right of appeal to anybody else. That's final. The only option you've got is to consider a judicial review. And we're often asked that this decision taken by the Ombudsman is clearly not fair. He's not thought it through. I want to go for judicial review. And we've never encouraged anybody to do that because it's expensive, it's not likely to work, and actually the bar is very high because to win in a judicial review, you have to show that there's something quite bizarre and unnatural about the decision or the process followed. And in reality, that doesn't work. But don't forget, the policyholder in this case still has the right of litigation. And if he's so aggrieved, he can go and see his local solicitor, and the solicitor can advise him whether or not he's got prospects of success in taking it further.
Yeah. If they haven't got the benefit of the FOS, the only alternative is to go to law. It's quite simple.
It does raise the question, though, Rogers, why would somebody have a complaint against a company that is not part of the FOS process? So in other words, it indicates that the complaint is against somebody that's not regulated by the FCA. Yes. And it might be some sort of associated organisation. To be trivial, it might be a plumber that's part of the process, in which case it may well be that there's some trade association that would be willing to look into the complaint for you.
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much. Martin Rayworth has asked, you said a complaint must allege material distress or inconvenience. What is material distress or inconvenience?
Well, it's got to be something that costs you something of value. You've got to be able to prove, if you want to prove a loss, you've got to show what the value. If we go back to the principle of indemnity, it's to put you back in the same position afterwards as you were immediately, same financial position afterwards as you were immediately before it. So if you are inconvenienced, I'm having to think very hard about how to give a simple example on this, but supposing your house burns down and you have to move out, and it's bloody inconvenient because it takes longer to get the kids to school and do the shopping and all the rest of it. But actually, you've got a perfectly serviceable house to live in for as long as it takes to repair it. Complaining about the inconvenience, you'd have to say, well, what is it that is inconvenient? You've got a house, you've got a roof over your head, there's no time limit on it, it's not costing you any money. So what's the problem? Oh, well, it takes longer to take the children to school. Yeah. Well, how are you going to measure that? So the point about it is that if in any form of compensation or damages-based solution, which is really what we're talking about here, in any one, you've got to be able to say, here is what it's costing me in material terms. And that's what we mean. I hope that answers the question, but that's as close as I can get to a quick answer. Mike, have you got anything to add to that?
Oh, no, I agree with that. Although to be fair, this discussion never crops up, because
No, it doesn't. No.
very few people seem to refer to that clause A that was on the slide. Do look at it later. It seems to be an issue that's largely forgotten.
It is, yeah.
And I think the common sense approach was they've got to complain about something that's gone wrong, and there's got to be something
There's got to be some substance in it that you can say, yes, I can see that's not right. Not just a win. I think the biggest thing.
I don't.
Go on.
Yeah, if you say I don't like the way that the insurance clerk spoke to me, well, that's something to raise, but it's not exactly a complaint to be referring to the FOS.
No, it's not.
I've got two questions on related to consumer duty and complaints. One is from Emma Wallacott, who's asked, with the consumer duty, is it now a good outcome, not a fair outcome? How do you see this affecting complaint handling? We have another one from Lindsay Guy, who's asked, do you think that the consumer duty obligations will change disparity in the example of the House on the Hill case?
Absolutely, yes. In fact, I will give a very short answer to that, that the way to ensure fair outcomes is to rediscover the fair and reasonable principle. It's over legalistic decisions that can leave the policyholder feeling that has not been a fair outcome.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I think the distinction between good outcome and fair outcome is unfortunate. I can't see why they shouldn't both be fair. I mean, it's, what is a good outcome for whom? A fair outcome, I think, has more meaning, but that's not what it says. But I think it'll probably be applied in the same way, don't you, Mike?
I would think so.
I think in practice,
it's got to be fair and reasonable. Fair and reasonable, that's the buzz phrase.
That's the buzz phrase, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, both of you. And we've got lots more questions, but unfortunately, time is running out. I'm sure that if people want to ask you questions, you'd be very happy to answer that them following this webinar. So I'd just like to say thank you very much to you both for delivering the webinar today and for all the information shared. The session today will also now be available on demand, and please feel free to share this webinar with anyone you think would benefit from it. Keep an eye out, as Flaxman Partners have a series of these webinars running throughout the year for you to benefit, and you will see Roger and Michael again. Thank you to all the delegates for joining us today, and we hope you have a good week. Goodbye.